Excellent. Okay, hello everyone. I am going to talk to you today about the afterlives of human cadavers and some of the weird things that have happened to famous people's bodies after they have passed on. And so you can kind of think of this as a sort of a festive weekend at Bernie's, but a hell of a lot weirder. And I want to start off in Ravenna. Here's a picture of me looking moody and with my eyes shut, as seems to be the tendency in photographs of me. It's in Ravenna a couple of months ago. And the reason we were here in Ravenna was to visit the tomb of Dante Alighieri, the great Italian poet. And some of you, Sam has already mentioned my husband, Dan Peterson, and some of you might know him as somebody who talks quite a lot about Dante. He knows a hell of a lot more about him than I do. So here Dan is with the great man himself. Um, but I am not going to be talking about Dante's life or about his work. I'm going to be talking about what happened to him after he died. So Dante dies in 1321 in Ravenna, having been banished from his hometown of Florence. And so he was buried in a Franciscan church in Ravenna. This was meant to be a temporary measure. It wasn't a grand tomb, but it ends up becoming long term. He spends about 200 years there. But the folk from Florence, oh no, we're a bit ahead. The folk from Florence want their poet back, even though they were less keen on him when he was actually alive. And in 1509, there is a chance. Ravenna has fallen under papal jurisdiction, and there's a Medici pope, uh, i.e., a Florentine, Leo X. And people keep asking Leo if he can get Dante's body back to Florence. We even have one person who keeps on saying that he's had Dante's ghost repeatedly visiting him. Uh, and he's begging to be let out of the odious tomb that he has in Ravenna. And we even get Michelangelo getting involved. He says that he will build Dante a tomb that's worthy of the poet's body in Florence. And eventually, with all this going on, Leo X agrees. So they go to Dante's tomb in Ravenna, they open it up, and they find it empty. The Franciscan friars who'd been caring for Dante's tomb for the last 2 centuries didn't actually want him to be removed. They've gotten quite fond of having his body there. So they extract his bones and they hide them away so that those people wanting to get them back to Florence, they can't get them. And then they kind of forget about where they are. And his bones sort of, they don't know what's happened to them. And then a friar finds them. And he figures out that they must be Dante's because whose else are they? And he compares them to the death mask of Dante. And so he puts them into a box. And we can tell this is the box that held Dante's bones from 1677 to 1865 because it's got an inscription. And it says Dante's bones. Placed here by myself and Friar Antonio Santi on October the 18th, 1677. But then they hide the bones away in a wall, and then Napoleon comes along. Um, he doesn't really like religious orders like the Franciscans, so they're suppressed, all the friars disperse. And that's in 1810. And then on the morning of the 27th of May, 1865, a bricklayer is working on the walls of the chapel and he accidentally comes across this wooden box. And he knows that it's got Dante's bones on it because look, it says it on the box itself. And so the bones of the great poet go on display and they get a nice grand sort of a glass box. It doesn't have the glass in anymore. The bones were threaded together using silk thread. They're laid out on a white silk cushion. And for 2 days in June that year, the people of Ravenna file past to see Dante's bones. And then they're buried in Dante's tomb. And here Dan is looking reverently at the tomb. This tomb was actually built when they had no idea where the bones were. And it wasn't the only tomb he gets, because there is one in Florence as well, in Santa Croce, where they make the rather interesting decision of making the poet topless on his tomb. But he never made it to that tomb in Florence, so he's here in Ravenna. And he's in his tomb, all good, you might think, but no, he gets moved again. Uh, in the beginning of the 20th century, a forensic anthropologist called Fabio Frassetto decides that he is going to examine the bones to see what secrets they hold. And in 1933, he produces this book on the bones of Dante. But the bones get put back, and then another thing happens. We get the Second World War, and the people of Ravenna are very worried that something may happen to the poet's bones during that. So this is the metal case, and you can see from that bit at the end, this is a substantial box. You know, they're making sure that these bones are secure. That Dante's bones are stored in out of his tomb during 1944 and not 1945. And this is the spot where they lay for those 2 years. So those are the bones of a great poet. And you can see they've effectively done this little sort of hokey cokey moving around over the hundreds of years since Dante died in 1321. But he's not the only poet that this kind of thing has happened to. For me, closer to home is this guy, Robert Burns, Rabbie Burns, the Scottish poet. And he died in 1796. He actually gets moved quite quickly. Because he's been buried in a graveyard in his hometown of Dumfries. And then in 1815, they get him a rather grander mausoleum. And so in here he goes in 1815. And then in 1834, his wife dies. Um, his wife Jean. And she's going to get interred in the mausoleum beside her husband. And at this point, a group led by newspaper editor John MacDiarmid and including a surgeon called Archibald Blacklock decide that they're going to take the opportunity of the mausoleum being opened up to go in and get Burns's skull. And they take a cast of it. This particular cast is in the Anatomy Museum at Glasgow University. Uh, Now, they said that they had permission to do this, but this little group actually do the whole job of getting the skull out, taking a cast, and putting it back under cover of darkness, which doesn't sound like something they have permission for. But the reason they want this cast of Burns's skull is because they're very, very interested in phrenology. Now, phrenology, in case you don't know, is and I'm going to put this in scare quotes, a science, pseudoscience, which involves looking at bumps on the skull, developments on the brain, which are indicative of your personality type. So people thought that certain lumps on the skull, certain developed areas of the skull, might indicate that you have a criminal personality or violent tendencies and things like that. Uh, and phrenology was very, very popular at the beginning of the 19th century. And I really, really like this cartoon because it kind of shows that not everyone was believing in it. But it also tells us a little bit about the history of phrenology, because you can see here it's entitled A Phrenological Lecture, and we can see that the cartoon is by J. Lump and L. Bump. Um, but if we look on the shelf here, we can see a jar which is marked Gall. And this is indicating Franz Gall, who was the scientist who had developed this theory about the lumps on the skull. In the corner, there's a bust, which, if you can see carefully, it reads Spurzheim underneath. This is Johann Spurzheim. He's the man who really, he was an acolyte of Gall, who disperses ideas across Europe. And this guy here who's giving the lecture, this is George Combe. Now, Combe was an Edinburgh-based doctor who was the founder of the Edinburgh Phrenological Society. Uh, And if you go to the National Portrait Gallery here in Edinburgh, you can see a collection of life and death masks that actually came from the Edinburgh Phrenological Society. And up here in the corner, these first two, this is William Burke and William Hare, who have certainly been mentioned in some of the talks that I've done for Sam previously. But of course, they were very interesting to the Phrenological Society because they wanted to see if there was any evidence of their criminal nature on their heads. And this was a big thing for phrenology. Uh, it also becomes incredibly unpleasant. This is the basis of a lot of very racist science, which involved a lot of people going out and collecting, again, scare quotes, slash stealing, and sometimes forcibly acquiring the skulls of people from around the world who they would return to phrenological societies like this to try and show that there was inferiority in non-white races. Of course, this is absolute bollocks. And thankfully, the theory has been entirely discredited nowadays, though, of course, it did feed into a hell of a lot of eugenic movements in the 20th century. But it did leave this legacy of skulls that came to the UK, to Europe, to the US for these very, 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 very racist purposes. And so this was the milieu in which they wanted to get a cast of Burns' skull, because what they wanted to show with Burns' skull was what the lumps on a genius might look like. And Burns was not the only great man who was the victim to phrenology hunters. Joseph Haydn, the composer, he was dug up shortly after his death to have his skull removed, and it actually took until the 1960s before they reunited it with his body in the grave. So here is a ceremony where an Austrian sculptor was involved in making sure that the skull was symbolically reunited with the body. The Marquis de Sade, uh, his own doctor, L.J. Ramon, he dug his body up very shortly after his death so he could get the skull out. So basically, waiting until it was going to be skeletonized before he gets the skull out. He takes a cast, which you can see here, and he makes his phrenological assessment of the Marquis de Sade. Uh, he establishes that the Sade had no excess erotic impulses, and in all respects, his skull is similar to that of a father of the church. Now, of course, that examination alone should be enough to suggest that phrenology is nonsense. Another reason why people were digging bodies up at this time in the early 19th century was for body snatching. And again, this is something that I've talked about for Sam in the past. For those who don't know, body snatching was something that went on to supply medical men, anatomists, with bodies to study from. This was a time when medicine was developing. Um, Medical schools were spreading across the UK and across Europe. Uh, the uh, legal source of bodies was simply not enough for the demand, and so the shortfall was met by men who would go into graveyards under cover of darkness and dig up bodies in order to sell at incredible profit to anatomists. And one writer ended up on the anatomist's table because of the body snatchers. Um, and this was something that people were very scared of happening to them. So in Edinburgh, you can see a moat safe in Greyfriars Kirkyard, which was something that was used to protect the graves. Uh, and here is my dearly departed Maisie examining that moat safe. But Lawrence Sterne did not have a moat safe over his grave. The author of Tristram Shandy actually was buried in London, away from his family, who was still up in Yorkshire. So he actually only had a couple of people who attended his funeral. And this is something that body snatchers may have watched out for. A sparsely attended funeral. That might suggest that nobody's going to be monitoring the grave very much in the time shortly after death. And so body snatchers dig up Lawrence Sterne, and he actually goes to the anatomist at Cambridge. So Stern is laid out naked on the slab in front of an audience of students, and then in walks the professor of anatomy to dissect the body. And he knows Lawrence Stern. You know, he's a well known figure. And a number of the students recognize Lawrence Stern. And so Stern's body ends up being dissected. You know, just because they recognize him doesn't mean that they're going to stop. But because they knew who he was, it's said that one of the students, out of respect for the writer, decides that he will return the body to the London graveyard from which he came. However, he doesn't return it to the actual grave. He just returns it to a piece of land which is easier to dig up, you know, and he certainly doesn't want to be caught messing around with somebody's grave because that can get you in trouble. And so in the 1960s, when that graveyard was actually being redeveloped and the bodies were being dug up and relocated, it was decided that Stern would be transported to the church near his family home in Yorkshire. The trouble is, he wasn't in his own grave. So what they did was they looked through the bones for ones that had anatomical examination. So effectively, what they're looking for is skulls which had had the calvaria sawn off. And they find a number of them. There's clearly been a number of anatomized bodies returned to this graveyard. So they have several skulls, and again, comparing to a death mask. They compare them to Stern's death mask to find out which one is the closest fit. They assume that is him, and then that skull and a femur, I'm not quite sure why they decided that was Stern's femur, are transported to the grave that you can now see in Yorkshire. Or is that actually Stern's skull? Because there is also this skull in the Duckworth collection in Cambridge, which is looked over by my good friend Trish Beers, and that also claims to be Lawrence Stern's skull. So again, a mystery about his body. Grigory Rasputin. Killed in 1916, he allegedly took a long time to die and kept coming back to life. But he has an afterlife too. So the Mad Monk of Russia, they decide that after they die, they're going to do something to him. And Rasputin uh, was reputed to have a very large penis. His daughter, and that's an interesting point in itself, his daughter says that it's 13 inches long. And so they cut it off and they preserve it. And there are now several versions of Rasputin's penis that can be seen in various places. This is the one that's in St. Petersburg. It's allegedly actually a horse penis. There's one in Paris that was seen by a friend of Rasputin's daughter who told her it looked like a black banana sitting on a velvet cushion. There's also another one which is apparently actually a sea cucumber. So a number of Rasputin's penises around the place. Another man who had things happen to his member is Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, when Napoleon Bonaparte died, it's said that his doctor, Francesco Ottamachi, he cut off the penis during the autopsy. And I have read one report that said that uh, Napoleon wasn't actually very nice to his doctor in his final days, and that this was possibly some form of posthumous revenge. And then his priest, and again, the involvement of the priest with the penis seems slightly incongruous, but his priest takes it to Corsica, to his homeland, and it stays in his priest's family for some time. But then the Vignali family, auction a number of Napoleon's belongings in 1916, and one of them, described as a mummified tendon, was his penis. In 1924, it was sold to a Philadelphia book collector called Abraham Rosenbach, and he actually puts it on display in New York in 1927. And the penis goes through a number of hands after that, which I understand is an unfortunate choice of words. And then it's sold again in the 1970s. At that point, it's offered to the French government. And it's alongside still a number of other belongings of Napoleon. The French government take the other belongings of Napoleon, but refuse to have his penis. And so that sells to a urology professor from Columbia University who buys it for $3,000 in 1977. And you've got to think that's a significant amount of money. I mean, you could buy a house back then for $3,000. And what this guy does, this urology professor, does with Bonaparte's boner, shall we say, he decides that he will keep it in a suitcase under his bed. Why he does this, we don't know. Some people have suggested that he actually, out of respect for the man, for Napoleon, that he wanted it taken out of circulation, and that's why he kept it hidden away. Um, of course, if you're doing something out of respect, just keeping a suitcase under the bed doesn't seem like the best thing to do. But there you go. It has never been photographed, apparently, and it's still in the family of the urologist who bought it back in the 70s. And one thing that we should say about Napoleon Bonaparte's member is that while it may not have, while Rasputin may have been reputed to have a rather large one, Napoleon's was not. It was said to be less than 1.5 inches, and apparently it looked something like a slug when it was being handed around and displayed in New York in the 20s. So he was reputed to have to be a wee man, Napoleon, but maybe his wee man was also wee. We've been talking so far about people who probably didn't want the posthumous lives of their remains, but some people have actually really specified what they wanted to happen to their remains after they've died. And one of them is this guy, Henry I of England. He died in Normandy after a surfeit of lampreys. And I mean, that really, why do you want to eat a lamprey? I mean, have you seen their wee faces? They're not nice. And having a few of them, I can see why that would kill you. And his body was taken to Rouen, where his entrails were removed, so the squishy bits that are going to decompose quickly, and they're buried there. And it's thought that once you've got those out, you're more able to transport the less squidgy bits. And he wants the rest of him to be buried at Reading Abbey. This is Reading Abbey that he's holding up here. And so he is transported back to England to Reading Abbey for interment. And this was what he had specified he wanted done with his body. Now, it is said while they were waiting at the Channel to cross to go back to England that they noticed a certain leakage from the container, the casket that was holding Henry's body. And that's again one of the things that can happen, when you're transporting a body, things will go a little bit runny. Uh, but this process of being buried in different places and specifying different places for burial is known as division of the body. It was often known as the German custom. And this is because in the Mediterranean countries, they very, very much disapproved of this as an idea. They didn't like the idea of being, taken apart and separated and you going off to different places. So they referred to it as the German custom. And obviously we're not talking about people from the German lands, here, but they were effectively just meaning anyone north of the Alps. Another person who went through division of the body was Richard the Lionheart. He died in 1199 in Chaillot in France. And that's where his guts were buried. That's where the squishy bits remained. And then his boiled bones were taken to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou. And then his heart was buried at Rouen Cathedral. This was where his father was buried, where his parents were. So his heart was embalmed, taken there, and laid at his father's feet. So this is division of the body. And as I say, it was really frowned on by those in the Mediterranean countries. And of course, this is the time of the Crusades. And so many people, many noble people, were going off to the Holy Lands, they were fighting, and some of them got killed. And often they specified that they didn't want to remain in those foreign lands when they were dead, if that happened to them, that they wanted to come home. And so often they would have their squishy bits buried, near Jerusalem or wherever it was they had been killed, and they would have their bones brought back to wherever it was they were from for burial there. And so eventually, because this was frowned on in the likes of Italy, it was banned. So in 1299, we get a decree, a papal bull by Pope Boniface VIII, which forbids the manipulation of corpses and their reduction to bones. And this is referring to this practice of division of the body. Now, there are a number of people, particularly certain men in the 19th century, who really wanted to emphasize a division between science and religion, who tried to make out that this bull was actually to do with anatomization and dissection. It wasn't. It was nothing to do with a religious prohibition on dissection, but entirely to do with moving the body around like this. And of course, my favourite of folk who have really, really known what they wanted to happen to them after they died is Jeremy Bentham. Now, Jeremy Bentham was very, very much involved in trying to make sure that anatomists had a legal supply of bodies so that they didn't have to rely on body snatchers, and was instrumental to the 1832 Anatomy Act. And he was a utilitarian philosopher. One of his main reasons for this was thinking that a dead body being stuck in the ground was a waste. You could do something else with it. And so his will specifies that when he dies, he wants to be dissected in front of an invited audience of his friends. And this is exactly what happens to him when he dies in May 1832. Uh, it's his friend Dr. Southwood Smith who he wants to carry out the dissection. And so one Friday, a number of people turn up to gather around his body as it is laid out in a dissection room in St Thomas's Hospital in London. And as Dr. Southwood Smith gives the oratory over the body prior to the dissection, there is a summer storm. This lightning flashing in the skylight overhead. The thunder can be heard rolling outside. And the thing is that this is not the only thing that Bentham specifies should be done with his body. He also says that once he's been dissected, Southwood Smith should reduce his body to bones. And then he should dress up his skeleton in his own clothes, padding them out with straw, and then he should pad the skeleton out with straw, and then he should take the head, and he should preserve the head in the way that the Maori of Aotearoa of New Zealand do with their ancestors. So for the Maori, what they would do is produce what they called toimoko, where the head is preserved so that it can remain amongst the family. That can stay with the family, can be taken out for celebrations and ceremonies, and it is an important part of your family to have your ancestor's head with you. And Bentham's been in correspondence with a number of people about methods that they can do this for over a decade before he dies. And Southwood Smith thinks he's come up with a method of preserving Bentham's head like this. However, it ends up somewhat weird. Best you can say is freaky looking. And when Southwood Smith sees this head, he says, in no way can we go out and put this on Bentham's body. Because what Bentham wants to have done with his body is for it to stay so that it can go to the meetings that he liked going to. So imagine you're going to a meeting, rather than your friend Jeremy Bentham coming along, you get this head coming out. And so instead, what they do is they make a wax head and they put that on his dressed up skeleton. And Bentham's head is just tucked away behind his legs and just kind of stays there. And the body in a glass case is displayed in the Student Union at UCL. It's still there. It recently got a fancy new case. Of course, this is in a student union. So you can imagine what students are going to do with a rather strange looking head. And there are a number of stories over the year of things that have happened to Jeremy Bentham's preserved head. One account says that it was the football in a student football match. Another says that he actually had a journey up to Aberdeen and back. Whatever has actually happened to Jeremy Bentham's head over the years, now it's very, very thoroughly kept under lock and key at UCL, but it is still there, and I'm going to get to see it next year, and I'm quite excited about that. 20th century, we get some people who have what we might think of as long term preservation. Again, they didn't specify they wanted this done. In fact, Vladimir Lenin in Russia, he was very, very adamant that there should be no reverence of the bodies of the deceased, that this seemed too much like religious relics to him. But Stalin had other ideas, and Stalin decides that Lenin should be embalmed, unembalmed for the long term so that he can stay among the people of Russia. And so a father and son called Zbarsky are brought in to be the people who will do the embalming. And this kind of long term embalming, has never been done before, and it takes quite a while. And it's an experimental process. And you can imagine in Stalin's Russia carrying out an experimental process on the body of, the great leader Lenin, that could be quite a risky business if you get it wrong. And Spassky did end up in a gulag for a very short period of time. But Lenin was embalmed. He's still kept on display in Moscow. And this also happened to other communist leaders. The same people who embalmed Lenin went to work on the body of Chairman Mao, which is on display still in Beijing. Uh, so this was not uncommon. It was really, really interesting that for Mao's body, it said that when they were pumping him full of embalming fluid, they kind of forgot and left the machine going overnight, and he puffed up and got very, very swollen. But it has worked. Though some people have said that maybe these bodies are just wax and not actually embalmed corpses at all. And as I said, this does seem somewhat similar to the kind of veneration that you can see with religious relics in Catholicism. And there are a number of stories about things that have happened with these relics. My personal favourite is of Francis Xavier, whose body was displayed in Goa. And one of the people who was coming to venerate him bent over to kiss his foot. And while she was doing that, bit off one of the toes so that she could take it home with her and have her own personal relic at home. But while Lenin's long-term embalmed body has largely stayed in Russia, in Moscow. It's had a few little trips out to different places for treatment works and things like that. Someone who's had a more exciting post-mortem life is this woman, Eva Peron, Evita. And she died of cancer at a very, very early age. And she had been such a revered figure in Argentina that it was decided that she should be embalmed. Uh, and a pathologist called Pedro Ara was the one who was brought in to do the embalming. In fact, Evita had been ill for such a long time before she died that her husband, Juan Perón, the president of Argentina, has actually started talking to Ara about her embalming before she dies. And the process cost, it said, in the region of $100,000 and took almost a year to do. Her body was displayed for 2 years in her office at the Ministry of Labour, where she worked. But then in 1955, the Peron government was overthrown by a coup. And the new government suddenly has the problem of what you do with a revered, preserved body. And they actually look at Evita's body, and it's so small and it's so perfectly preserved that they, like with Lenin, think that it's just wax. And they actually chop off one of her fingers just so that they confirm that this is actually a corpse and not a wax replica. They find out that it is. And so they decide that what they're going to have to do is bury the body because they don't want this to become a rallying point for their opponents. And the man put in charge of this is Colonel Carlos Koenig. And he has the body in a van to take to be buried. But weird things keep happening. Everywhere he parks, he finds that flowers appear outside the van and he moves them, but more keep appearing. And he takes this as a sign that it is a bad idea to bury Evita. And so instead, he hides the body in the attic of the military intelligence building where he works. And she stays there for some time. Then it's discovered that that's what he's done. And so they decide something has to happen with Evita's body. We need to get her out of Argentina. But they don't want anyone to know where she's going. So there are a number of false Evitas, false bodies that are sent to various places so that no one can track down which one is the real Evita that's been buried. She ends up being buried in Milan in 1957. And then a couple of years later, she's reunited with her husband, who is in exile in a villa in Madrid. So she's brought there to him and his new wife, Isabella, who does her makeup and her hair. They fly Pedro Ara over just to give her preservation a bit of a top up. And then Peron is re elected in Argentina. And so in 1973, he flies back to Buenos Aires. Evita remains in Madrid, and he dies in office the following year. And then there's a bit of a strange blackmail situation um, because some of the people want Evita's body to return to Argentina. You know, she's in Spain, that's not where they want her to be. And so they take another corpse and they basically bargain saying we're only going to give you this body back if you bring Evita back to Argentina. And so her husband's new wife brings her body back to Argentina. And they get in a new man to come and do some work on the body just to make sure that it looks its best, and it stays at the presidential palace for a few years. Then in 1976, there is another coup. And again, Evita's body becomes a problem. It becomes something that might become a rallying point for enemies. And so at this point, she is actually buried in the cemetery where her family were buried. She's allegedly buried in a cast iron casket, something like 20 feet below ground, in a method that would fend off a nuclear attack. Again, whether or not that's genuine or whether that's to stop people trying to dig her up, anyone can guess. But since it's Christmas, let's finish off with a romantic story. A story to do with Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet. And he dies after a sailing accident in 1822, and his body washes up on a beach in Italy. And the laws in Italy at that time meant that because he'd been in the sea for 10 days, that transporting the body can't happen. They thought this would spread disease. And so, while deciding what to do, they bury him in some quicklime and then they dig him up and they decide to cremate the body. Uh, so, we have this beautiful painting done something like 70 years after Shelley's death of him being cremated. And he looks very peaceful there as he lies on the fire. We've got to remember that he wouldn't have looked so beautiful. He had been in the sea for 10 days and then buried for a further 6 days. And his friend Trelawney said the face, hands, and part of the body not protected by the dress, by the clothes, were fleshless. So he wouldn't have just looked like he was sleeping on the fire there. And his friend Trelawney reports that amongst the flames, the corpse fell open and the heart was laid bare. And I should say that this heart is actually a chocolate heart. It is edible. It would not have survived the flames so well. heart was kept by Shelley's widow, Mary Shelley, for the rest of her life. Though from everything that I have read about Percy Bysshe Shelley, he was not deserving of such devotion. Now, from my point of view, is it actually the heart? You know, a heart is a relatively small organ. It's been through a lot with everything that's been going on the 2 weeks since Shelley died, and then it's set fire to. And while the flames are probably not of the heat of a modern crematoria, which, does get very, very hot and could reduce body to ashes very, very quickly, it's much more likely that the heart um, would be less likely to survive than other organs. So it's been speculated that what was grabbed out of the fire was not the heart at all, but Percy Shelley's shrunken liver. So maybe it was the liver that Mary Shelley carried around for the rest of her life. And we'll never know, because when Percy and Mary's son, Percy Shelley, died towards the end of the 19th century, it was actually buried with him. But this is Percy Shelley's grave in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And that's the point where I'm going to finish on this very festive survey of the afterlives of a number of famous cadavers. But thank you very, very, very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take your questions now.